Where is Terraria? I mean, I know where it is literally, but where does it take place? This seemed like a pretty straightforward question at first, but the deeper I dug, the more convoluted and confusing the answer became. So join me as I try and uncover this mostly overlooked piece of Terraria lore. Let's start by asking the most basic of questions. Does Terraria take place on Earth? Each Terraria world is relatively small in comparison to our player, and is always flanked on both sides by oceans, which leads me to believe that it's some kind of a small island. Could the answer really be as simple as that? Are we just on some small undiscovered island out there in one of our oceans? Well, no. On the one hand, we have many familiar sights, such as traders, animals, trees, and rain. But on the other hand, we have traders, animals, trees, and rain. What I mean to say is, although there's quite a few familiar elements to a Terraria world, there's also many strange and magical occurrences that simply don't exist in real life. But that doesn't rule out Earth, necessarily. There's many fictional depictions of our planet with magic systems and futuristic technology. Perhaps Terraria is yet another. So I decided to shift my focus to the geography of a Terraria world to see if it reasonably lined up with what we would expect from a depiction of Earth. The biomes all seem to make sense. I mean, we would expect to see forests and deserts and jungles, and even the fictional environments could be reasonably explained by the magical narrative. But there was just one environment that seemed off to me, and that was space. In a medium-sized Terraria world, which mind you, isn't even the smallest world size available, we are considered to be in space at only 600 feet above the surface. And we reach the upper limit at only 900 feet, which, keep in mind, that's shorter than the Empire State Building, or like Plainville, Kansas. But we are limited by the confines of a video game here, and the Earth is a big place. So maybe what we're seeing in game is just a scaled down version of the planet. If this was the case, we would expect the ratio between the planetary crust and the atmosphere to be roughly the same in both Terraria and real life. We already know that the boundary between space and the atmosphere in Terraria is at 600 feet. And by digging to the bottom of the world, which I think we can reasonably consider to be the boundary of the crust and the upper mantle, we find that the planetary crust is about 2,500 feet thick. This gives us a ratio of 4.22 to 1, or in other words, the crust is 4.22 times thicker than the atmosphere. So then, what's Earth's ratio, you may be asking? Well, it depends on where you take the measurements and what you consider to be the edge of space. But I'm just gonna go with NASA's numbers here and say that it's roughly 0.6 to 1. Now, if none of that made sense to you, I don't blame you. Numbers are stupid. So, let me put it visually. If the crust of the planet is this thick, then this is how thick Terraria's atmosphere is. And this is how thick Earth's atmosphere is. These are not the same picture. Okay, but maybe having a super thick atmosphere just didn't make sense for gameplay, and the devs took a bit of creative liberty when designing the game. This doesn't necessarily mean that we're not on Earth. But wait, do you guys see that? This is not our moon. And it's not even the only moon in Terraria. Every time you create a world, one of these moons is selected. So what does that imply? I think for starters, we can officially rule out Earth. But it's not unheard of for some other planet to have multiple moons. Maybe depending on where your Terraria world is located on this fictional planet, a different moon is visible in the sky. I could probably get behind that theory if it wasn't for one item. Once you've completed 50% of the bestiary in a world, the zoologist will begin selling the moon globe, which, when used, changes the appearance of the moon. Last time I checked, it was not possible to change out celestial bodies by simply throwing an orb on the ground. So then, what's going on here? Well, I have a couple of theories. It could just be that the magic in this world is extremely powerful, to the point where a magic artifact with the ability to transform the moon is sold by your local furry. Or perhaps the entire Terraria world is actually a simulation where it would be super simple to change the appearance of the moon. But the theory that I personally find to be the most compelling is what I am dubbing the dome theory. Imagine for a second that the entire Terraria world is contained within a Truman Show-like dome. This would explain why the atmosphere is so small, and it would also explain why you can change the appearance of the moon so easily. I mean, if the entire sky was just a projection, then it would be pretty simple to make some small changes. And circling back to the Truman Show comparison for a second, what does the geography of that dome look like? If you said an island surrounded by small bodies of water attempting to pass as oceans, then you would be correct. Does that sound familiar to anyone else? It should, because that is exactly what the Terraria world looks like. And get this, the clother makes a bunch of references to movies, all starring Tom Hanks. You want to know another movie that Tom Hanks has been in? The Terminal, which was co-written by Andrew Niccol. You know what else Andrew Niccol has written? That's right, The Truman Show. Boom! Concrete proof that Terraria actually takes place within a dome simulating reality. Okay, so maybe that last part was a bit of a stretch, but I do still think that the dome theory holds some weight. However, there's one final thing that I want to consider before drawing any conclusions, and that is the crossovers. Over the years, Terraria has slowly expanded the amount of content it has from other games, to the point where we now have weapons, pets, armor sets, and even entire bosses from games like Dungeon Defenders, Core Keeper, and soon to be Dead Cells. But it doesn't stop there, because the crossover content goes both ways. In Stardew Valley, you can get a Meowmare by reconstructing a forest pylon, and in Don't Starve Together, you can even fight the Eye of Cthulhu. But what does any of that have to do with the location of the Terraria world? Well, a lot actually. I believe what this implies is that all of these games exist within the same reality. And with that in mind, I now present to you my final theory. We find ourselves in the distant future. Technology has progressed rapidly, allowing for things like teleportation and body augmentation. Yet the planet is in trouble. Perhaps its threat of outside invaders, otherworldly monsters, or an environmental collapse. Regardless of the cause, the world leaders want to be ready. So they create the Save the Earth and Mankind Directive, or STEAM for short. But what does STEAM do? Well, they create massive domes, each containing a specialized micro-world, in order to test specific scenarios that may threaten the planet. In one dome, they test advanced weaponry and defense tactics against a never-ending horde of invaders. In another, they determine the feasibility of surviving underground in the event that the surface becomes uninhabitable. And in the case of Terraria, they are testing the effectiveness of various weapon and armor combinations against powerful entities that may threaten the planet in the future. But that's just a theory that pertains to video games and stuff. Thanks for watching. Hello? Yeah, this looks good, right? What's up, I'm Rudolph. In Terraria, you can get the Meowmare by reconstructing a forest pylon. Did I say Terraria? Bro, yeah. You can get the Meowmare in Terraria. Did you guys know that?